Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, making one of these, a Japanese scabbard chisel. So quite a few years back now, I made a video about how I made one of these, a Japanese style scabbard chisel, or nomi as they're also called. Now, they're absolutely one of my favorite tools. It's just a tool that'll do a lot of things that no other chisel on the planet will do. And I use them all the time. Anyway, every few months I get somebody shooting me an email asking if I'll make one of them for them. Unfortunately, I always have to tell them, sorry, too expensive, to make one of these as a one-off. I just have to charge them a fortune. Well, it finally occurred to me to just make a batch of them. It won't bring the price down to zero, but it'll make it so that I can hook up people with this really very useful tool, which, by the way, is almost impossible to find on the market. So follow me today as I make a batch of these suckers. As always, like and subscribe and click that bell. If you want to pick up my free PDF about how to get started in knife making, link in the cards and description. All right, let's get cranking. So let's start by talking about the design here. A saya chisel is used to carve the channel in a Japanese sword scabbard. Japanese sword scabbards are made by gluing two wooden halves together into which a channel has been carved to contain the sword. If you're interested in more information about that process, I did a video recently that takes a deep dive into how that works. Anyway, the point is that a normal chisel is not at all suitable for this process for two reasons. First, a straight-faced chisel, just any old normal chisel, tends to keep going in whatever direction you aim it. That's really the whole point of the thing. So when you're trying to make a long channel, it just digs into the wood and you have big problems. Second, a straight chisel will cause you to smack your knuckles on the wood. So the Scabbard Chisel has solutions for both these problems. First, it has a curved belly that just really changes the geometry of the tool and allows it to skip in and out of the cut real easily. It doesn't just dig in. You sort of have to do this to see why it works, but it does work great. It just does stuff a normal chisel can't begin to do. In Western woodworking, this is known as a bull-nosed chisel. But the other cool thing about the saya chisel, and what separates it from Western chisels, is that it has a bend in the handle so you don't tear up your knuckles as you work. The result? A chisel that's ideally suited for carving channels in wood, including the handles of hidden tang, forged knives like Bowies and things like that. I'll begin with a piece of 7/16 inch W1 drill rod cut to 1 foot lengths. W1 is a water hardening high carbon tool steel similar to 1095 but with narrower, stricter specifications. The forging here is really bone simple. I'll use a rounded die to expand the width of the drill rod sufficiently that I can end up with a tool that's about 1 centimeter wide or just under 1/2 inch. Like I said earlier, my aim here is to make a batch of these tools, 15 in all, so in order to work efficiently, I'll keep several pieces in the fire. Now there's a reason the old phrase, too many irons in the fire, came into being. You don't want to stick in tons and tons of them. If you do, you can mess up your steel. I found 5 sticks was about right. After widening the stock, I'll change dies and flatten it to about 1/4 of an inch. The next phase will be done by hand. I'll forge in the bevel or cutting edge. Even things up Then forge in the bend in the tang. I'm aiming for about 8 degrees, but there's really no magic number here. Next, I'll check for straightness again. And then move on to the next chisel. This is kind of fun work, just trying to work as quickly and efficiently as I can. Once all the forging's done, I'll normalize the chisels to reduce grain size, which always increases during forging at high temperatures, as well as to reduce stresses in the steel that might cause warping later. Hey guys, quick note, if you're a fan of the channel, do us a solid and help support us on Patreon. As a thanks for your support, you'll have access to plans for most of my knife builds, including the chisel that we're working on today. Now, if you've been enjoying the free content here from me for this past decade and change, believe it or not, now's your chance to give back. Link in the cards and description. Patreon.com/Walter Sorrells. Then it's over to the grinder to clean up the cutting faces. Grinding is by far the most time-consuming part of making these chisels. There's nothing super interesting about it, though I should mention that I'm keeping the back of the blade flat for now, as it makes the other aspects of grinding easier by keeping all these various surfaces square, the top, the sides, and so on. I won't grind the belly that we talked about earlier into the blade until the chisels are actually hardened. Now it's on to heat treating. At this point, these are chisel shaped, but not hard enough to use as cutting tools. I'll heat the chisels to 1475 in my heat treating oven, then do a 2-step quench. A second or two in water, followed immediately by quenching in oil. I'm using Parks 50 here, but pretty much any oil would do. You don't need an engineered quenching oil if you're doing it this way. The real work of stampeding past the nose of the cooling curve and down toward martensite start happens in the water. Why 2 stages? Knife makers are well aware that water quenching tends to cause cracking, but cracking mostly happens in the very last few degrees of cooling. I've found that the slower cooling that happens in oil after bringing the steel down to martensite start will generally decrease the likelihood of cracking significantly. After that, it's 2 hours of tempering at 350, which yields a Rockwell hardness in the 61 to 62 range. Chisels, of course, have handles. So let's take a break from the metal and do some woodwork. I'm going to be turning the handles by hand on a wood lathe. So I've chosen a bunch of different wood for the job, little scrap pieces that I've got just to give the tools some variety. Sapele, maple, zebra wood, and walnut. First, I'll saw them to size. Then, using a little homemade V-block sort of thing, I'll get them ready for the lathe. This is pretty simple turning, all of it using lathe tools I made by myself, by the way, using pretty similar techniques to what I'm doing with this chisel. First, I'll turn a cylinder, then I'll use a cutoff tool to indicate the ends of each handle. I made most of them 5 inches, but I made a couple of them 6 inches, just for variety. Then I'll taper the handle and finish up by rounding the butt end. Finally, a little sandpaper. And some wax for the darker woods. I'll apply polyurethane on the lighter maple later. You'll notice that I've left them on the spindles. The reason for that is that I'm going to be taking them to my laser engraver to pop a logo on the handle, and this works easier if you have a longer piece with flat sides that won't rock around inside the engraver. Next, cut them free from the spindles and drill the hole for the tang. So, back to the metal work. First, a little cleanup on the grinder. Now, in the past, I've always ground the curved belly on these blades by hand. This had a tendency to result in slightly irregular curves. But since I was doing a bunch of these, I decided to make a tool just for the job. I'll do a video in the next week or two that explains this grinding jig in greater detail, but the idea is that I've got a pivoting holder that uses magnets to hold the blade. Then you just kind of scrub it back and forth to grind the angle. It's got several different pivot points, so you can grind a variety of radii. I should mention at this point that I've made several side chisels over the years, including some quite a bit wider than the ones I'm using here. Obviously, you'd want different radii for wider chisels or they'd come out looking like spoons. Hence the ability to do different radii on my little grinding jig. The reason that I'm only making the thinner chisels in this batch is that I do about 95% of my scabbard work with the thin size and only use wider ones for cleanup and smoothing. Anybody who's looking to acquire one of these for themselves, I would highly recommend picking up the thinner ones rather than wider ones. And now we're ready for assembly. I'll epoxy them later, but there's nothing more to this than shoving it into the hole, which has been drilled for a friction fit. As you can see, the front face of the chisel is just slightly curved. If you grind the bevel flat and the rear curved, that curvature on the front edge just naturally appears. Now, if you look at it, it really seems kind of insignificant, but it makes a huge difference in what the chisel will do. Obviously, it's no use for doing normal chisel tasks like cutting mortises, but if you want to chisel out any sort of channel, for instance when roughing out a handle channel for hidden tang knives, unbeatable. And there it is, ready for my next scabbard job. Making these 15 tools goes a lot faster when you're able to batch the work than it would have making them one at a time. Still, it took the better part of a week to make all of them. You save a ton of time batching the forging, a good bit on the turning and heat treating, but unfortunately, while you save a little bit of time on the grinding, frankly, it's not a huge amount. And there we have it. Hope you found this useful not only about how to make a chisel, but also about batch work in knife making. Like I said earlier, if you're interested in owning one of these incredibly useful tools for yourself, you can pick one of them up from my website, waltersorrellsblades.com. All right, guys, thanks for watching and keep on making those knives. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. WalterSorrellsBlades.com.